Hello, colleagues. Welcome back to the OCHA Staff Welfare Podcast, #Let's Talk. Today, we're going to be speaking with an expert on trauma and trauma recovery for humanitarian workers. If you would like to know more about trauma recovery, and resilience, please stay with us while we discuss this important topic. Today, we are privileged to host Fiona Dunkley on this podcast. Fiona is a senior accredited MBA-CP psychotherapist, trauma specialist trainer, counselor, and founder of FD Consultants, offering psychosocial support and trauma specialist services for humanitarian aid organizations. She has worked in the public, private, and charity sector, including globally with humanitarian aid workers, the NHS, Metropolitan and City Police, and the transport industry. She's been running her own counselling business for over 15 years and has her own book published in 2018 called Psychosocial Support for Humanitarian Aid Workers, a Roadmap of Trauma and Critical Incident Care. So thank you, Fiona, for joining us today on this podcast. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me.
Great. So I'll go ahead with our first question. So could you tell us and explain what trauma is?
Yeah, so there are many facets to trauma, really. So it'd be useful for me to just explain some of these different terms. So there's post-traumatic stress disorder, some people may have heard of as PTSD. There's the acute and cumulative impact of trauma. There's traumatic grief, vicarious trauma, and developmental trauma. So it's worth me just explaining each of these. So if I start with post-traumatic stress disorder, this is caused by exposure to threatening or distressing events, sometimes perceived as life-threatening. And I think the word perceived here is important because as trauma therapists, we never judge someone's response to trauma or one trauma being more impactful than another. It's very much based on how an individual experiences that incident. And that's useful for anyone to know who's supporting someone with trauma, to keep that in mind. And within the sector, it's been cited that 30% of staff experience post-traumatic stress disorder. And this also correlates with the research from UNHCR, where I think their wellbeing survey suggested 36% of staff were experiencing PTSD. And if we put this in perspective, the general population is about 5 or 6% of PTSD. So this is much more aligned with emergency first responders. It's a high level of PTSD working in the sector. So there's a high level of risk. And the types of incidents that can lead us to experience trauma could be such things as transport accidents, sexual violence, living and working in war zones, natural disasters, domestic violence, being displaced, assault, acts of terror, accidents, physical and mental health challenges as well. Organisational restructuring can be traumatic for people if they feel they're going to lose their jobs. Bullying and harassment in the workplace, and also living and working through pandemic. So actually right now we are in a trauma incident. This is about life and death. And therefore we're all going to be more heightened into our stress response right now. And recently at FD Consultants, we carried out some research on psychosocial support for staff living and working in fragile states. And data has also shown that PTSD levels are higher in these regions. And again, UNHCR reported that PTSD was much higher in the MENA regions and actually is probably underreported as well. So when organisations are trauma informed, they usually have good practices in place to support staff after major acute traumatic incidents, such as the Beirut explosion. But what we find is it can often be overlooked for supporting staff who experience the more cumulative or chronic trauma. So that may be, for example, in Yemen or Myanmar, where they're experiencing ongoing everyday traumas. So this can include being forced from your home, forced imprisonment, risk of sexual violence, violent attacks. And so these staff who need support, they can often be overlooked. So another term to refer to is traumatic grief. And this is different than bereavement. So traumatic grief is when we lose someone suddenly. So that can be through suicide, through a transport accident, or even in the pandemic, because losing someone through COVID, we may not be able to visit them in the hospital. There may be limited numbers to funerals, and this can be really traumatic for people. But what we find as trauma therapists is that we have to support someone through the trauma first, processing the trauma before they can grieve. And that's why traumatic grief counselling is different from bereavement counselling. And the other term to touch on, particularly in this sector, is vicarious trauma, which can be referred to as secondary traumatization. And I think it's important because we can be exposed to trauma directly, but also indirectly. So this would refer to fundraisers, researchers, people involved in comms or social media, that all can be impacted by vicarious trauma. And again, UNHCR Staff Wellbeing Survey highlighted 38% of staff were suffering from vicarious trauma. And again, that's a really high number of staff. And what we found over the last year is that IT, artificial intelligence, counter-terrorist groups have reached out to us for our workshops on trauma and vicarious trauma awareness. So organisations are becoming much more aware of the impact of vicarious trauma on staff, as well as the direct impact of trauma. And just another term to mention is developmental trauma, which actually refers to trauma in our childhood, which could be physical, sexual, mental abuse, bullying at school, and can lead to more complex trauma later in life. But the reason I mention it here is because if we're supporting someone who's had a trauma in the workplace and they have unprocessed childhood traumas, it may be that it's brought all of that up to the surface as well. So we may be helping them through processing their historical traumas as well as the actual workplace trauma. So hopefully that's explained some different terminologies and facets to trauma.
Yeah, thank you. That's the very detailed answer. I think when we think of trauma, and I think the first thing we think of is PTSD, and maybe people who are exposed to war, extreme events. But you've shown that there's a lot of variation when it comes to critical incidents and trauma. Can you tell us more on how trauma happens and what the common symptoms are?
Yeah, so when I refer to symptoms of trauma, I mean, we run a lot of workshops on stress management, anxiety, trauma awareness. And I say that stress, anxiety, trauma, they can have similar symptoms, although obviously when we go through those, they become more intensified. But there's a different brain patterning that happens with trauma that leads us to have the flashbacks and the intrusive thoughts. So in very, very simplistic terms, it's useful to think of the stress response, our survival response, which is our threat response activated through a traumatic incident as well. We think of our brain in three different parts. So if you think of the central part as your reptilian brain, that's your kind of basic survival part of the brain. It's eating, sleeping, temperature, breathing. We can't live without it. And then if you imagine the next layer of brain, our limbic brain, mammalian brain, that's about our emotional content. And then we've got the prefrontal cortex, which is our language, analytical, thinking center. And when we're stressed, that part of the brain goes offline. So we're left with emotion and reaction. And then we also talk about two other parts of the brain, the amygdala, that's your fire alarm system. So when we are activated into our threat response, the amygdala, our fire alarm system, will fuel our system with adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol. And when we've come through the other side of a traumatic event and it's been processed, we file it away in our hippocampus. That's our filing system of the brain. But what can happen when we're still in a trauma, for example, living and working in a war zone, it's very hard for us to file that information away because we don't feel safe. So that means that the amygdala, our fire alarm system, can be activated, and it could be a certain sound or a smell, and we can be triggered back into that trauma as if it's still happening. And that's what causes these flashbacks and intrusive thoughts. So there's certain approaches to trauma therapy that can help move that information and process it away into the filing cabinet of the brain. So typical trauma symptoms, I mean, we often talk about trauma, same as stress and anxiety, we hold it in our bodies. The body keeps the score, the body remembers. And there's such a variety of symptoms that people can feel that they're going mad. It's a really distressing combination of symptoms. And what we often say is that this is a normal reaction to an abnormal event. So specific trauma symptoms will be the intrusive thoughts, the flashbacks, the feeling hypervigilant, on edge, And because those memories don't get date stamped, they don't get filed away in that part of the brain that places experiences in the past. And that's why they can be triggered and be intensified in the present moment. And additional symptoms might include difficulty sleeping, nightmares, avoidance, feeling detached, emotional outbursts, lack of concentration, and this general feeling of unsafe. I'm unsafe. And we run the stress management and resilience building workshops, and in there we talk about a stress cycle, and it's made up of 4 factors: feelings, thoughts, behaviours, and physical symptoms. In the trauma and vicarious trauma awareness workshop, we talk about a trauma box. So it's still made up of thoughts, feelings, behaviour, and physical, but often people describe their symptoms as feeling like they're boxed in. And neuroscientists often state that we have this negative brain bias when we're stressed, and it's particularly true with trauma. So many people after a traumatic event, they feel that they're to blame, or they're bad, or they're powerless. And through the trauma therapy, we help them to process that and get that rational part of the brain back online that challenges those emotional thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. That's really insightful, and that'll be really useful for colleagues who might have experienced a critical incident or may have symptoms of trauma. It's to have that awareness of what their symptoms could be. That's really useful. Thank you, Fiona. And you speak on reaching out for therapy, for counselling, and coming forward if you have those symptoms. And I have a question on that, because sometimes staff will not seek out psychological support because they fear that they're being perceived as weak. So, speaking from your experience, why is it difficult for humanitarian staff to seek treatment for trauma?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And I think there are lots of factors that play into that. But when I did the research for the book, 85% of staff that we interviewed felt stigma was an issue in the workplace to talk out about mental health in this sector. And often they were citing, fear of not being promoted. So I'm going to be judged in a negative way. Also, fear of not receiving the appropriate support that they would need. And another reason that we found, because we've just done some research, I mentioned earlier around staff in fragile states, is actually lack of knowledge prevents people from reaching out and creates that stigma. So people are going to judge me as crazy, or there's something wrong with me if I reach out for psychological support. But actually, if we can give the psychoeducation, it's so important, because then we can normalize it. You know, when we're managing and supporting people with trauma, the first thing we do is normalize. So actually, to see these symptoms as I say, a normal reaction to an abnormal event. And it's normal to have these responses, and then we can put in stabilization and resourcing and support people better. So giving the psychoeducation, giving the preventative services, so the kind of training, that mental health training around this. And, I suffered post-traumatic stress disorder in my early 20s. I talk about my own experience of having had PTSD, and this is over 30 years ago. So at the time, I didn't understand what trauma was or how to reach out for support. And therefore, I suffered much longer than I necessarily needed to. And then what can happen is some people turn to these unhealthy coping strategies to suppress the symptoms. So that could include drinking too much, or even becoming a workaholic. Often we don't see that as an unhealthy coping strategy, but it is, and people are trying to suppress and avoid their symptoms. But actually, long term, this will lead to much worse problems, and lead to maybe more risk behaviour and lots of physical issues. And I think there's other factors involved. So like I say, it's quite complex. I think the type of individuals that sign up for this work, we want to make a difference in the world. We're passionate, and therefore we can often overlook our own self-care for the greater cause. So that was another theme that came out in the research for the book. And this can lead to guilt. Lots of humanitarian workers that have come to me for counselling have talked about this sense of guilt. Who am I to reach out for support when all these terrible things are happening in the world? But if we don't, then we can't continue to do the good job that we're doing. So, a lot of what I do is about prioritising our self-care and looking after ourselves and building our resilience and noticing those signs in ourselves when we need to reach out for support. Because as trauma therapists, the earlier you come for support, or the more you can do to support yourself in the initial stages, the quicker you can recover. Because what can happen is it can lead to much more complex issues if we don't. And we know that vicarious trauma can turn into PTSD if it's not dealt with earlier. And the other thing is also to have services that understand the context, the culture, and offer services in the appropriate languages. So I think some people have reached out for support and perhaps haven't got culturally specific support, which hasn't actually then been that helpful. Other things. So some of the things that could be helpful to challenge stigma, I just did a webinar on psychologically safe management. I'm happy to share the link with you if you're interested. But for managers to be given the tools to recognise the signs in staff. So it's mental health awareness training, incorporating peer support programs, and so we start to normalise that language. We give a common language for mental health, so we can start talking about it more openly and creating that safe environment where people can speak about it without feeling that they're going to be judged in some way.
Thank you, Fiona, for your contribution on that, and that's really important. At OCHA, the staff welfare unit set up peer helpers and now peer assistant helpers, and what they do is if they see colleagues struggling and they come to the peer helper with an issue regarding mental health, well-being, anything like this, then they will refer them to the staff counsellor. And so it creates that bridge towards the service that the staff welfare unit provides. And also they help promoting the psychosocial webinars and educational material and events, everything that the counsellors are providing. And also they can pick up on those themes that might be particularly useful to tell the staff counsellors on areas of particular concern that they see in their office or their region. So that's also helpful.
Yeah, and it's great they're picking up on themes, as you say, isn't it? And creating that normalisation, and they can do the signposting. So all of that sounds really helpful.
Yeah, the peer helpers are doing some really great work. So in terms of accessing professional help, people naturally recover from trauma. So when is the best time to seek professional help and counselling?
Yeah, so the majority of people will recover naturally. So I talked about that disconnect between the fire alarm and the filing system, the hippocampus. And actually there are cells called dentate nuclei that blow a fuse when we're overwhelmed with a traumatic event. And they can regenerate. So that's good news. We talk about the plasticity of the brain. So most people will recover naturally. But generally it's stated that if symptoms persist for 30 days or around 4 weeks, then the individual may need more specialist support. And at FD Consultants, we're trained in, as we're trauma specialists, we're trained in eye movement desensitization reprocessing or trauma-focused CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. And these are the trauma approaches recommended by WHO, APA, and the NICE guidelines. And actually, what's wonderful about EMDR is that you can probably recover very quickly in about 6 sessions, 12 sessions maybe at the most, for PTSD. And other therapies might take a year or 2 years to do the same thing. So it is really important that people understand there are these specialist approaches to trauma therapy. And actually, even though in those 4 weeks, like the peer supporters, there's a lot that can be done to support people and help them recover. So as I mentioned, the normalisation, stabilisation and resourcing and the psychoeducation, all of that can be really helpful. And actually how someone is treated directly after a trauma has a huge impact on their recovery, which is why it's useful to train managers on mental health awareness or to have that robust peer support programme. Because sometimes when people come for trauma counselling, after a while they stop talking about the incident, but it's something someone said to them in the immediate aftermath of that event that gets stuck, because we're much more heightened to those things, much more sensitive to those things.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And yeah, it's definitely important to seek support. I think it's better to be guided through a process, especially something like trauma, rather than trying to deal with it yourself. There's no shame in seeking professional support to help you through it. So if it's available, then it's worth reaching out, definitely. And as a final question, in your book, Psychosocial Support for Humanitarian Workers, you speak on the Resilience Toolkit. While we can't discuss the whole chapter, could you please provide some key recommendations from this Resilience Toolkit and that will help staff build resilience for their humanitarian work?
Yeah, so it's a whole chapter in the book, as you mentioned. So I created the Respect to Resilience model. And it brings together a great deal of research on what resources enable us to remain resilient in difficult times. And also the acronym RESPECT reminds us to respect ourselves and to prioritise our own self-care. So, because there can be this theme of sacrificing ourselves for the greater cause. So actually we need to prioritise our own self-care. And also we need to role model what is good self-care, because we know that stress, anxiety, and trauma energy is contagious, and that's bottom up and top down in an organisation. So we all have to take responsibility to role model what is good self-care. And we all know that if we have a particularly stressed manager, often then the team are going to feel really stressed. So this toolkit, we use it in our stress management workshops, also in our trauma support workshops. So R stands for relaxation. We're finding ways to relax and calm the body. As I said before, that trauma, that energy can be held in the body. And sometimes when I'm doing an EMDR session with someone, they can feel that kind of electricity or that tingling sensation. So they're releasing some of that energy from their body. And so one really simple technique I use is we refer to the 4 elements: earth, air, fire, water. And so air is about breathing, and a really simple breathing exercise is to make our out breath longer than our in breath. So really simple exercise that calms down the system. It does the opposite of what the stress cycle does. The grounding is really about, if we go for a walk, activate our senses. What do we see around us? What do we hear? We're going to be in the present moment rather than in our head of what we're going to do when we get home or what work we're going to do next. So grounding is about being in that present moment, connecting with nature. And water is literally drinking water, because actually the saliva dries up when we're stressed or when we're activated into trauma response. So drinking water, it keeps the digestive system activated, and that can shut down when we're traumatized, which is why we get so many stomach problems. And then fire is for imagination. So that's the kind of meditation, visualizations, and we've got quite a few you can download off our website. So I'll give you the details of that at the end, maybe, of the talk. And so it's kind of doing some of the meditations that we have on our website. So that's a really easy way of relaxing the body, thinking about the 4 elements: earth, air, fire, water. And then E is for education. So it's the psychoeducation. It's understanding the mechanics of stress and trauma, the physiology, the neuroscience. That's something we go into in more detail in the workshops. But I mentioned about the 3-part brain, the fire alarm system, that filing cabinet. Also, what's really helpful, particularly with trauma, is to identify what are the triggers. What are those triggers that are going to cause the flashbacks and the intrusive thoughts? Because a lot of people will come and say, oh, I've just been activated into a flashback, but for no reason. It's out of my control. And there will always be something that's triggered them. So we just need to bring that into the conscious awareness of what that might be. And also, noticing how we might be activated. So even watching the news, we can be activated, particularly at the moment in the COVID and the pandemic, we can be activated into that trauma response with the vicarious trauma. Anniversaries can be a big trigger as well. So they're kind of identifying what the triggers are, the psychoeducation. S is for social connections. So there's lots of research to show that when we make connections and we keep connected to our go-to people, who are our go-to people, friends, family, colleagues, are we part of an organization? Laughter is really important. So, I'm very careful when I expose myself to the news because I work in trauma. So I will choose to watch things very light-hearted or things that make me laugh outside of work. Pets, again, is important, possibly good resource in social connections. P is for physical. So that's more about how do we come into contact with our physical body, so the diet. We know that caffeine, nicotine, sugar, alcohol intake are going to make the symptoms more magnified. Although people will reach out for those in the initial stages, but if it's becoming a crux to support ourselves, then we need to look at that, because it's going to be causing a lot more physical problems in the long term. As I mentioned, being in nature, but also physical spaces. What do we have around us? When we set up our workstations, what do we have? Little anchors around us that can make us feel good. So it could be images, smell. Smell is, out of all our senses, is the quickest way to get information to the brain. So I know through the pandemic, diffusers and ointments and things like that have gone up in people are buying those more and have them around them to support themselves. And actually, people who have PTSD and anxiety and panic attacks often carry little ointments around with them, those kinds of smells, because it's the quickest way to get information to the brain. E is for exercise. It speaks for itself. So it's about staying active. It increases the endorphins, the serotonins, the good feel-good hormones, rather than the adrenalines and the cortisols. C is for creativity. And research has shown that activates the opposite part of the brain than the stress response. So it could be drawing, photography, learning an instrument, could also be singing or dancing, or could be doing puzzles or gardening or baking. So think of something that you could do in regards to a creative activity. And then T is for thinking. How do we challenge those negative thoughts? Because, as I said, neuroscientists say we have this negative brain bias when we're stressed, and it's magnified when we're traumatized. And so how do we challenge some of those negative thoughts? Thinking of counter arguments, using mantras or quotes. Think about what you would say to someone if you were supporting them, because we can be so hard on ourselves in our time of need. And hopefully, if anything that the pandemic has taught us, is to slow things down, be kinder on ourselves, appreciate the smaller things. And so bringing some of that into the thinking, like being compassionate and kind to ourselves. But the main thing for me around trauma is about how do we enable the individual to feel safe, because their sense of threat has been acutely activated and it's unable necessarily to settle. So all of those resources help us settle the stress response. And I often end these talks on a quote by Porges, who's a trauma specialist. And he says, if you want to improve the world, start by making people feel safer. And that's hard while we're going through a pandemic, of course. And the other term that's useful to end on is post-traumatic growth, because there's lots of research now written about post-traumatic growth. And actually, my book is full of case studies of individuals and how they've been impacted in their mental health through their work and how they've recovered. And then post-traumatic growth takes it even the next step of how they've used those experiences to go on and help others. And my own story of post-traumatic growth, of having had PTSD, and now I've set up FD Consultants in how to support people who are traumatized, and we specialize in trauma care. It is part of that too.
Great, thank you so much. And it's so nice to hear your personal story on how you experienced a traumatic event and eventually got the help you needed and have grown, and now you support others. And that's a real inspiration for anyone else who's going through this. And I really resonate with the resilience toolkit that you talk about, especially with the breathing exercises, walking, spending time in nature, trying to shift your focus to external stimuli rather than focusing on your symptoms. Because, often with trauma and stuff, you do have that constant feeling of anxiety, and it's important to shift that focus sometimes to help deal with it. And that's really, really good.
And one thing I wanted to add is that everyone can recover. I really strongly believe that everyone can recover from PTSD with the right help. I strongly believe that.
Yeah, that's great. And I believe that too. And I really hope anyone who does have symptoms or have experienced trauma can get the help that they need. And I guess this is a time to just tell colleagues that if you've heard anything during this podcast that you think you can relate to, if you have symptoms of trauma or you've experienced a traumatic incident, to reach out to the staff welfare unit at OCHA and contact one of the staff counselors, and they can help you and find you a specialist to help you deal with that. As Fiona was saying, trying to get professional support on this will make your recovery much easier and much better. So yeah, please do that.
Yeah.
Any last remarks, Fiona, before we wrap up this podcast?
I suppose the only other thing I didn't mention is the delayed response to trauma. So actually 30% of people have a delayed response, and that could be weeks later, months later, sometimes even a year. So if you are supporting someone who's been exposed to a traumatic incident, it's worth, I always say to managers, follow up, follow up, follow up. Just check in with them on a regular basis. So if someone initially says, no, I'm fine, it's worth checking in with them again at a later date, because they may not be fine later down the line. So that's one thing I would also add on there.
Yeah, an excellent point. I think that can sometimes be overlooked. I learnt that reading your book.
Oh yeah, great.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us today, Fiona. This has been very interesting, and I think it will definitely resonate with colleagues.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.